We'll just get started. Sorry for the delay. We were having some difficulties with the WebEx login. So today we'll be hearing from Barb McGuire from the Disability Law Center. And then we have Andrew Riggle here from the Disability Law Center as well. And then, apologies, can I get your name again?
Patrick Whiting.
Patrick Whiting from the Disability Law Center as well. So today we're going to be talking about Fair Housing Act and fair housing practices. Last April was Fair Housing Month, and it was the 54th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. Salt Lake City joins other municipal governments and the state to affirmatively further fair housing choices for all Americans, regardless of their race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, national origin, or their source of income. And this year we focused on accessibility in housing, transportation, things like that. So this is an extension of that. So we're grateful for Barb to present. And Salt Lake City is committed to expanding equity and access for all Americans and all residents of Salt Lake City. And some of the things we do is partner with great agencies like the Disability Law Center, and we fund some other agencies that work on housing equity. So, and then we're also very grateful to work with the Mayor's Office of Equity and Inclusion to further equity projects throughout the city. So I will pass it over to Barb right now.
See them. Good job, Ethan. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. Thanks to Ethan and Tony and the city for inviting us over to talk about fair housing. And just out of curiosity, how many of you have had a fair housing training before? I recognize a few of you from maybe some of the trainings I've had. So I'm really glad that there are new faces here today. And this is actually the first time I've done this specific training. And so this is a new experience for me. I'm probably going to raise more questions for you all as well as me today. So we'll probably just have more questions by the time I'm done talking than we do right now, but that's okay. We can continue to have conversations about this. So like Ethan said, I'm with the Disability Law Center, and do you know how to advance the slide on this?
Or the arrow's not working?
No.
What?
Oh. All right, cool. So before I get started, I just want to give this disclaimer. I'm not an attorney, so just kind of keep in mind that the information that I'm going to be going over today is the general information about the Fair Housing Act and the fair housing laws. We have attorneys on staff. In some situations, we can maybe help give technical assistance to different entities. I know that the city has your own attorneys, and if you have questions about anything that I'm going over, it will probably best or be more appropriate for you to go that route with questions, because we love working with the city, but we could also potentially be on the opposite side of a complaint as you all. So I'll just throw that out there. Just really quickly, a little bit about the Disability Law Center. We're what's called a protection and advocacy agency for people with disabilities. So kind of like a civil rights organization for people with disabilities. There's a federal mandate that says there has to be an agency like ours in every state in the country. And so we've been designated as the protection and advocacy agency for Utah by the governor. We assist people in a number of different areas, but I'm not going to talk about what everybody else does at my agency. I just kind of want to move right into fair housing work and talk about the Fair Housing Act. So the fair housing team at the Disability Law Center, we've kind of had this team going 10 years now. So we started in 2012. We receive our funding from HUD. And because we receive our funding from HUD, we actually serve all protected classes, which we'll be talking about. So not just disability. So even though we are at the Disability Law Center, we deal with all types of housing discrimination for the Fair Housing Program. We cover the whole state, and we don't charge for our services. So the program that we have does basically three things. So we enforce fair housing laws, and that could look a number of different ways. So if somebody feels like they have experienced discrimination in housing, then they can call us, and we can maybe assist them through a situation. Sometimes we'll educate people about maybe how to remedy on their own. Sometimes we'll have attorneys step in and help mediate situations with landlords. And that usually happens when there's an accommodation request that's been denied. And we also file complaints against landlords and other types of housing providers with HUD or the state if we feel that there's discrimination happening. And then we also do fair housing testing, which is most of what I do. And fair housing testing is like secret shopper, except with apartments and discrimination. So we have a pool of people that we utilize to call landlords, and I monitor their interactions with landlords for signs of discrimination. And then we also do education and outreach. It's obviously really important for people to know what their rights are. And then also housing providers or people in the housing industry. It's really important to know what the Fair Housing Act says and what you should be doing. So that's what our program does. And before I talk anymore, I just want to throw this out there. What is discrimination? Because that's what I'm going to be talking about. Anyone could throw it out if you have a guess. Yeah.
One part of your group providing preferential treatment to another part of your group based on shared characteristics.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. And how I like to explain it is just someone or a group of people being treated differently because of something about them, right? And so that something about them can be a lot of different things, and that different treatment can also be a lot of different things and happen in a lot of different contexts. And so obviously we deal with it in housing. And so a little bit of history about the Fair Housing Act. I think the history of fair housing and fair housing laws in our country is really interesting. So historically, discrimination in housing was very overt, very obvious. So before the Fair Housing Act. So these are some images from US cities from the 1940s and 1950s. So we want white tenants in our white community. We serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexicans, no blacks, no Irish, no Jews, okay? Or people would hear things like, we don't rent to people like you, right? So we don't rent to blacks, we don't rent to Mexicans, or we don't rent to refugees, or fill in that blank, okay? So it's very out in the open. There are also a number of other practices that were in place / still are in place. One of the most common is called redlining, or one of the most familiar. So I think a lot of people have heard about redlining, right? So it was a practice that was implemented by the federal government where in the lending industry, they would look at neighborhoods and identify the areas that had high concentrations of people of color and draw little red lines around those areas on a map, and then refuse to offer loans to people in those areas. So people in those areas were basically stuck in those areas and couldn't move out. Okay, so redlining is pretty famous. That was a map of Philadelphia. This is actually a map of Salt Lake City that was used for redlining in the 1950s, I believe. So this is Salt Lake. I don't know if any of you have seen this before, but you have areas that are highlighted in green and blue that say, yeah, we'll give loans to people in these areas, but then the areas that are highlighted in red and yellow are the areas that they were deemed undesirable for loans. Okay, so this is from here, and I'm just going to throw this up. So this is actually a dot density map of Salt Lake today. So on this, the orange dots represent white as a racial identity. All of the other colors are non-white, and you can kind of see there's really not much difference about where people live in Salt Lake today as how it was 80 years ago. So that's kind of sad, but yeah.
Let me go back to now. Does that say to the other one? Does that say still desirable?
Yeah, so it's like definitely desirable, still desirable, definitely declining, hazardous. Okay, so those are the categories on this map. But again, there's still a correlation, right? So the effects of those practices back then, we're still seeing those effects today. One other practice from pre-Fair Housing Act that I'll mention is what are called sundown towns. So these would be places where there would be local ordinances that limited who could live in certain places, okay? And so if you kind of think of like the South in the 30s or 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, a lot of these were in play there. So these ordinances would say things like, if you are Black, you can work here, you can shop here during the day and spend your money, but you just can't live here, right? And so you need to be not here where the sun goes down. So that's where that name comes from. And the consequences for somebody breaking one of these ordinances could be arrest, but then also think Deep South during the early part of the last century, like lynching was a thing. So the consequences of some of these ordinances were pretty horrific. A little bit of history about laws, so protections. The first federal protection that kind of tried to deal with discrimination was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So again, right after the Civil War, it addressed race only, and think of slavery during that time, and race was a huge national issue. And so this act said that all citizens should be equally protected. And it's just kind of a should thing. And there were no penalties there was no enforcement piece to this law. It just said, yeah, you should treat everyone equally. States and others found more and different ways to discriminate against people, heading into the Jim Crow era. But this was the first one. And we like to mention this because this is still applicable today. There are fair housing agencies that will still file complaints or lawsuits that go back to this 1866 Act if it has a racial component. Nothing much happened for the next 100 years, but housing became a big issue during the Civil Rights era. Congress was very resistant to add housing as a protection during that time because it would mean they would have to integrate their neighborhoods in the North, not just in the South. But Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April of 1968, and Congress finally saw they needed to do something in response to that. And that's when they enacted the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which we call the Fair Housing Act, that was signed into law a week after Dr. King's assassination. And there have been some amendments since then, but that's what drives mostly all of the fair housing work, and mostly all of these concepts that I'm going to be talking about. Again, the Fair Housing Act was enacted to give people equal opportunity in housing situations. And it identifies a number of groups of people that we call protected classes that shouldn't be targeted for harassment or discrimination. And does anyone want to throw out some protected classes that are in housing? Do you know any? Yeah, 3, right. Yeah, national origin. Sorry, I didn't hear those last couple. Yeah, family status. So I'll just throw it up, okay? So race as a protection, color, national origin, religion. So those were the 4 that were in the original 1968 Act. Sex was added in the early 70s. And then familial status and disability were added in the 1988 amendment. So the states can't go below those 7, right? But we can add more protections if we would like. So here in Utah, we have 3 additional protected classes. So we have source of income here in Utah, which is a great protection, and it would be wonderful if it was a protection on the federal level. But that relates to where someone's money is coming from. It's going to help pay for their housing, and for the most part, that means government assistance. So here in Utah, landlords should be taking Section 8 vouchers or other types of housing vouchers as an example of that. Also, at the state level, we have sexual orientation and gender identity as protections too. But at this point in time, because of some Supreme Court cases and executive orders, those actually kind of fall under the protected class of sex at the federal level now and are pretty much protected everywhere at this point. So that's who's protected by fair housing laws. And you'll notice age wasn't a protection. So age is a protection in employment, but not in housing. So next question I want to throw out there or try to answer is, who has to comply with fair housing laws? So here's a list, and it's not 100% inclusive. So landlords and owners, okay? So people in the rental industry, renting apartments, mortgage lenders, so banks giving money to people, insurance agencies, so homeowners insurance, rental insurance, realtors, management services, so brokers, property management companies, and then also state and local governments, and that means you all, and that's why we're here, because as representatives of Salt Lake City, that means that we really need to think about Fair Housing Act and fair housing laws, because the city has to comply. So what housing is covered? So like, what are we talking? What kind of situations does the Fair Housing Act deal with? So for the most part, most housing is covered by the Fair Housing Act. So from duplexes on up to apartment complexes with hundreds of units, those are all covered by the Fair Housing Act. There are some exemptions, but there are also some exceptions to the exemptions. But most housing is covered. So one example of an exemption would be 4 units or less that's owner occupied. So if I have a duplex and I live in half and I rent out half, I'm not covered, okay, because it's just 2 units and I'm living there. But if I'm using a property management company to rent out that duplex, it's covered again because they're in the business, even though I'm living there. Or single family homes are also exempt. Okay, so if I have a house, I'm renting it out on the side, it's not covered. But again, if I'm using a property management company, it's covered. So I'll say it one more time, most housing is covered. And if you ever have any questions about it, err on the side of caution and assume that it's covered. And then call us and we can help sort that out. Also, kind of going into other situations. Oh yeah.
Just a clarification on that. For single family homes, do you have to live there?
No. Yeah, so the owner occupied is only for duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. So 4 units or yet less owner occupied. Yeah, so single family homes are slightly different.
Okay.
So it also covers other situations like public housing, student housing, senior housing, condos, homeowners associations, group homes, shelters, so like homeless shelters, domestic violence shelters, sober living houses. So those are all covered by the Fair Housing Act. I mentioned lending. It also includes appraisals and insurance, like I said. And then also lastly, vacant land, which might be developed for housing. That's going to be covered by the Fair Housing Act. Zoning and land use. And also just other ordinances that have some sort of housing connection and policies and practices as well. So again, this is really extending to cover you all as a city, be obligated to follow fair housing rules. Before I kind of get into specific examples of discrimination or things to think about, I want to throw this up. There are 3 theories of discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. And as a city, you need to think about all 3 of these. And they look differently, but I want to quickly explain them. So the first one is called disparate treatment. And it's kind of just what it sounds like you're treating someone differently. Oftentimes this happens on like that individual level. So if a landlord doesn't want to rent to someone because they belong to a protected class and they say, sorry, it's already been rented, that's disparate treatment. Denying accommodation requests, things like that. Disparate impact is kind of moving a little bit higher up on that micro, meso, macro. individual systemic level. So this one relates to policies. The disparate impact means that is a policy or a practice in place that might seem neutral or even fair on the surface. But if you dig a little bit deeper, it affects different groups of people who belong to those protected classes differently. Okay. So again, on the surface, it's fair, but the reality is it has a different impact on different people. An example of that would be background check policies. Okay, so if there is a property and they run background checks on people, which it's a very common thing, right? We run a background check on everyone. Everyone gets a background check, so it's fair, right? Not necessarily. Okay. Two examples of why not. So people of color are disproportionately represented in our criminal justice system in the United States. So more people of color have more interactions with law enforcement and get arrested than people who are white. So right there, you're going to be screening out more people of color if you have a policy related to background checks. That makes sense. Same thing applies for people with disabilities. People with disabilities are also targeted more by law enforcement than people who don't have disabilities. So background check policy, inherent in that policy, you're going to be screening out more people with disabilities. So those are two examples of disparate impact situations. The third theory is called a failure to affirmatively further fair housing. And that one's a mouthful. And Ethan actually mentioned this one in his introduction. He said, you all as a city are attempting to affirmatively further fair housing. So that's a phrase that's in the Fair Housing Act. This concept is a little bit more, I don't know, nebulous, I suppose. Those first two kind of say, don't treat people badly, don't discriminate, right? For that first one. The second one is don't have bad policies. But for this third one, it's more of a, you need to go above and beyond that. Okay, it's more than just not discriminating, more than just not having bad policies. It means that jurisdictions who receive federal funding need to take a look at their jurisdiction and see where people are living and try to make attempts to create inclusive communities and have housing opportunity for everyone who lives there. Okay, so it's more than just don't discriminate. It means, yeah, we need to do something extra to make sure people have opportunity. So yeah.
Is this also sort of the order of difficulty of enforcement?
Oh yeah, definitely. So like enforcing this is all different. So like disparate treatment is like testing, fair housing testing, absolutely. I can gather information for disparate impact, but we would also want to look at policies, look at, you know, racial and ethnic demographics of areas to see who might be affected, things like that. And then, yeah, moving up to that third level, it's going to be all of that, like looking at the policies and looking at who's living where and all of those things. Yeah.
Can I throw a real world situation at you?
Yes, but I can't guarantee that I can give you a good answer.
I know that Michelle just here, but we're working on a tiny home village that,
Yeah.
but the organization that's running it wants to over living. And it's supposed to be permanent housing. So you can do, it's not saying you can do sober living and have restrictions if it's a program like intended for that purpose, but this is intended to be.
Mm-hmm.
So they want to do drug testing to get into the housing and then alcohol. But alcoholics are just, by definition, if they've gone through treatment, they're a protected class. So if it's intended for permanent housing, which should have low barrier to entry, how it's a potential violation of fair housing to not let people who can't live.
Mm-hmm. Michelle agrees with that, right?
I mean, the whole situation is a lot less complicated than that, but.
Yeah, yeah,
And our attorneys have written it.
yeah. And I'm not an attorney, so you know.
But
it's
like, you're,
yeah, I mean, it sounds like it can be problematic.
and it's unfortunate because they're wanting to do something good, but it, at minimum, I think it's the bottom.
Yeah, yeah. And honestly, like another issue maybe with that I thought about, it's like where it is, right? So thinking about you're concentrating programs in different areas instead of spreading those out, right? So like the west side of Salt Lake, South Salt Lake, I think they kind of bear the brunt of a lot of like homeless services and treatment services, right? And so like where it is could be problematic too, instead of, well, why aren't these spread out throughout the county? So I responded with another issue, but yeah. Was there another hand? Uh-huh.
It was sort of a follow-up to Tammy. The current Other Side Academy on 17, is also the sober living environment,
Yeah.
but it's a program, it's not something.
They couch that as a 2-year program, and
Okay.
in talking to HUD people and our internal attorneys, like, it seems like there's more of a.
It's a house, the home, or.
I didn't hear anything.
Oh, that's right, you did say tiny home builders.
Oh, don't worry. It's
Yeah. 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 So again, it's I was sure that you were aware of this, but yeah. So these are the different ways to theories of discrimination that you all should think about. And then again, before I move into like other specific things to think about, I want to talk about the protected class of disability, throw out a few ideas and concepts related to it. So the protected class of disability, the Fair Housing Act has some additional protections or additional rights for people with disabilities if they're going to need them to be able to use and enjoy where they're living. Okay, there are 3, and does anyone know what they are? Yes.
Are we saying types of disability?
No, 3 additional rights for people with disabilities. Any guesses? Yes, yes. So I think I heard somebody say accommodation and modification. So reasonable modifications, reasonable accommodations, and then also design and construction requirements for new properties that are being built, multifamily. And I'll talk more about these, but the definition of disability is also important to understand. It's kind of a broad definition. This is similar. So this is the Fair Housing Act definition, but it's similar to other definitions you'll see like in the ADA. So it says there's a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities. So seeing, hearing, walking, breathing, taking care of oneself. Okay. It also says if someone is regarded as having an impairment, I might not have a disability, but if the landlord thinks I have a disability and they discriminate against me, that's not okay. It also talks about having a record of having an impairment. So a couple of examples of how that might look. Maybe there's a person who has bipolar disorder, and sometime in the past, they had encounters with law enforcement. And now in the present, they're trying to find housing and they're being screened out because of that record. Okay. So something in the past is getting in the way of them in the present from finding housing. And people who are sober also fall under this. Again, I used to go party a lot. Yeah, I did some stuff, but I'm sober now and I'm trying to find a place to live, that I can't find anyone who will rent to me because of that background. Okay. And so landlords should have flexibility with those things. Designing construction requirements. I won't spend tons of time on this. If you want to design and construction training, there's like a big old manual that talks about all the technical specifications. We can help facilitate that. But new properties are supposed to have 7 elements included in them. So accessible entrances and on accessible routes, accessible public and common use areas, accessible usable doors, routes within a dwelling, accessible light switches, plugs, other types of controls, reinforced walls in places like the bathroom. So people, want to put wrap bars in, they can do that. And then also usable kitchens. So again, that's all I'm going to mention about that, except that, remember, I mentioned this is a new construction. So this is for any building that has been constructed after 1991. So this leaves out actually a lot of situations, which is unfortunate. So the old public works building, there was this idea of the housing project there, right? Renovating it. So that was built before 1991. So these standards don't apply. So that's something to think about. If you want to go above and beyond and be more inclusive, if somebody wants to develop that, hold them to these standards instead of saying, oh, it's okay to not be accessible. So yeah.
So this applies to new construction, doesn't include like renovation of completely rehabilitating buildings?
No, it's kind of like the question I hear that you would ask yourself is, what was on the ground when you started? If it's dirt, then this applies. If there's something else, it doesn't. So again, like you could take it down to only the foundation, and this won't apply. So yeah, I'd really encourage you to think about that. Andrew has a lot of thoughts on that, and we can have a conversation about it later. But yeah, like if you want to go above and beyond, you can hold people to a higher standard. So more accommodations, modifications. So accommodations and modifications, again, they might be necessary for someone to be able to like really enjoy and use where they're living. Modifications are physical or structural adjustments. Accommodations are exceptions to rules or policies. So modification examples would be like grab bars in a bathroom, installing a ramp. Okay, so those are physical. Accommodations are, this is your policy. You don't allow animals, but I have an assistance animal or a guide dog. Can I have my animal there? Right? Make an exception to that no animal policy so I can have my animal there that I need for my disability. Okay, so it's a couple of examples. More examples. Parking. So maybe there's an apartment complex that doesn't assign parking, or someone lives in a neighborhood and all of the street parking gets taken up, and that person has a disability and they need to be able to park close to where they live. So someone can say, hey, I know you don't assign parking, but I have a disability and I need something close to my front door. Can you please assign me a spot? Okay, so that's an example. Lots of examples. Exceptions to like setback requirements. If somebody needs to install a ramp at their house. Other different zoning ordinances. So there can be, ordinances about unrelated people living together, but that might have an effect on people with disabilities. Okay, so like we've talked about sober living as an example. Yeah. Yeah, so HOAs as well. Other examples, assistance animals and how they relate to zoning. So we've had cases, or we have like partner agencies who have had all of these cases. So we had a case where there was a family who had a child with autism, and it was therapeutic for the child to take care of a goat. They didn't live in Salt Lake, but it was another city in the valley, and there was an ordinance restricting animals. And if you're going to have a goat, you can't just have one, you need two, because they're like a social creature, and they'll probably destroy anything anyway if there are two of them, but it will be worse if there's just one. So they needed two goats. And so we hope to ask for an exception, that ordinance restricting it to one so that the family could have two. But so that's an example. Fences. Honestly, like one of the reasons why I was really excited to present today was my sister has a disability and we needed to ask for an accommodation through the city because we live here in Salt Lake City. And that whole process didn't go very well. And ours was related to a fence. So like there are exceptions with fences. And again, this isn't all inclusive. There are lots of different examples. So when it comes to these three things need to be present, the person has to have a disability. Someone in the household has to have a disability. If there's not a disability in the situation, these things don't apply. Okay, so this is only for the protected class of disability. There has to be a relationship between what someone is asking for and their disability. Okay, there has to be a connection there, and somebody actually has to need it. Okay, so there needs to be a need, the disability, and a connection between those two things. And then when someone is making a request, so someone must ask for an accommodation. Okay, so someone shouldn't just assume that things are going to be okay. You know, someone shouldn't assume it's okay for them to lower cabinets in their apartment and start deconstructing. You know, they shouldn't start, you know, building their ramp in front of their house. There should be a conversation. That doesn't always happen, but there should be a conversation about it. The request for an accommodation can come in any manner and also at any time. So verbal requests are valid requests. Written requests are also valid requests. We always suggest people put them in writing. It's just, you just should. But if somebody asks you for an accommodation request verbally, you should take it seriously at that point, okay? Not, we need to have you put that in writing first, okay? You can document it after, but them asking you is a request, okay? And then also anytime. So this can really come up, you know, when people maybe have like an assistance animal. Thanks, Ethan. You know, like I need to find an apartment, but I have my assistance animal. Like, should I tell the landlord before I move in or after I move in? And that's up to the person to decide, right? So if I tell them before I move in, they might deny my application. But if I tell them after I'm approved, they're not going to like it, right? But it's okay for them to ask anytime. You know, and then also just a couple comments about that. Not everyone knows about what an accommodation is. Not everyone with a disability knows about this. So somebody might need something and they might just move their dog in and not even know that this is a thing. So that could be a reason why somebody doesn't ask. Another reason is maybe they've asked before and, you know, they are so used to being turned down that they just don't want to go through this process again and they don't ask. But if you find out somebody has started an accommodation or modification, like they moved their animal in, they've started construction, and then you shouldn't retaliate against them because of that. You should start that conversation at that point about what they need and move forward from there. Also, the request can be made on somebody's behalf. It doesn't have to come from a person. So like I said, I have made accommodation requests on behalf of my sister. But it could also be a case manager or another relative, okay? Or somebody else who the person with a disability has asked to represent them. So it doesn't have to be coming out of the mouth of the person with a disability. Verification. So this is another important thing to think about. So as a housing provider, housing providers may request documentation to verify disability and need, okay? And I want to start with that underlined may up there. You may, okay? A landlord has this right. You as a city have this right. You don't have to, okay? You don't have to force someone to verify. If someone comes to you and they say, I have a disability and this is what I need as an accommodation, you can just go with that, okay? Landlords don't understand that concept at all when I try to explain it to them. And I'm sure your attorneys will say, no, we need to. And you don't have to. Just say you don't have to. But if there's a situation and somebody asks for an accommodation If somebody has an obvious disability, you shouldn't have to make them jump through more hoops to verify that they have a disability, okay? So if Andrew walks into your office and he wants to build a ramp in front of his house and he lives in Salt Lake, does he have a disability? Yeah, it's okay to say yes and acknowledge that. Right, he's using his chair, and he's way faster at getting around in that thing than me. But so like you can see he has a disability. So you don't need to then make him go to the doctor and get another note to verify what you can see, okay? So obvious disabilities, you shouldn't be making people jump through those extra hoops. But not all disabilities are obvious, and not all connections to from what somebody needs to their disability are obvious. So in those situations, you can ask for verification, right? You can't ask about confidential information, okay? We did some testing where we gathered a whole bunch of HIPAA releases that landlords were forcing people to sign. It's like, I'm asking for an accommodation, okay, but you need to sign this HIPAA release so we can call your doctor and have access to your medical records. No way, okay? Or asking about the nature or severity, or somebody can, like, can you live independently? Or how bad is it? How bad is your disability? Those questions are no-nos. Also, verification can come from a variety of sources. A lot of times there's this misnomer that it has to be a medical doctor, and that's not true either. It can be a medical doctor, but it can be some other healthcare provider. You know, it could be a physical therapist, occupational therapist. It could be a mental health practitioner. It could be some other sort of professional, like a caseworker at the homeless shelter who has been working with their client for 15 years. Like, they know their client, they know their disability, so they should be able to verify. And I don't have this one up here, but also family members. Like, if you think about a child with autism or a child with a disability, who knows that child's disability better than their parent and what they need? Like, I've been living with my sister, like, I've known her for 40 years, and I know her disability, I know what she needs. So in some situations, a family member could also be sufficient. Reasonable is something to think about. You know, that's in front of both modification and accommodation. And so a request shouldn't impose an undue financial burden or administrative burden, okay? So if somebody's asking for something that's gonna cost a landlord or cost the city a lot of money, then it's maybe not reasonable, or alter how you run your business or the nature of your operation. It also shouldn't cause harm to other people. So if somebody's asking for something that's gonna put the safety of others at risk, it's also reasonable to deny that, okay? But again, it's case by case. There are lots of different disabilities. And even if there are two people who have the same disability, what one person needs might be different than what another person needs. So everything is case by case. And what somebody's asking for might seem unreasonable, but you should keep talking. You need to continue that conversation. It usually ends up bad for landlords or housing providers when somebody makes an accommodation request and it's a hard and fast no, and I'm not even going to talk to you about it, okay? There should be communication. There should be dialogue. There should be a conversation about, okay, that's maybe not reasonable, but what is reasonable, okay? So looking to find a compromise. And then also, you have a lot of departments and you're interacting all the time. You know, it's like planning and zoning, you know, talk with transportation, you talk with the people who are, you know, studying, is this a historic house, right? Because there's stuff that relates to that. There's a lot of communication within your departments. So you should think about who might need to be part of this conversation when it comes to accommodation or trying to find a solution. 5 more minutes. I want to get through a couple more things. Zoning and land,
So you want,
we started late, so I have
Yeah.
extra time.
yeah.
Okay,
110.
okay. So zoning and land use. So remember, fair housing laws cover zoning and land use. Typically, zoning and land use laws fall upon a state or municipalities. But when it comes to the Fair Housing Act, it's gonna trump those, okay? So if there's like an accommodation or we're talking discrimination, it doesn't matter if, like I said, typically it's a state local thing. The Fair Housing Act is going to override it. So think about decisions when you're you know, talking to developers, general conversations about ordinances, because they shouldn't discriminate against people in protected classes. So some examples quickly of zoning, maybe zoning issues, policies, again, like I said, might give an advantage to some groups of people, but disadvantage people in protected classes. Blocking group homes is an example, okay? Even if there's opposition in neighborhoods, you all and cities and jurisdictions shouldn't be giving in to the public outcry, and you should do what's right. So if there's a lot of outcry about something, and you decide to pull a project, that could be discriminatory. And I've been having conversations with one of our attorneys the past couple of days about the process a few years ago when it came to where are we going to put the shelters, right? So Draper City volunteered to have one, but at the town hall meetings out there were 1 million people screaming at the 4 million homeless people and the mayor at that meeting, and they backed out, right? So that could be potentially discriminatory for what the city did, like caving to that public opinion. There's also the Sugar House shelter, right? And that was in Salt Lake City. Right. So again, caving to public opinion. They don't want certain types of people. That could definitely be discriminatory. Denying accommodations. Already kind of talked about that. Zoning and land use. Thinking about families with children. There can also be discriminatory practices there. So examples might be, yeah, will approve certain types of housing, but not other types of housing. Okay, will approve senior housing, but not multifamily. Okay. We would love to have the quiet old people move into our neighborhoods, but we don't want those kids here. Okay. Types of apartments in projects. It's like, oh, we want to have this, like, we want to revitalize this area, make it like trendy and hip. So, we want a lot of cool adults living here. So we're just going to allow 1-bedroom units. Okay. No 2-bedroom units. So that means no families. Okay. So situations like that could be discriminatory. A little bit more also related to people with disabilities. Again, group homes. Some other things to think about with group homes. Well, one, limiting them, not allowing them is maybe an issue. Requiring them to be a certain amount of distance from each other could maybe be an issue. It's like, okay, well, we have one here and we can't have one within 2 miles. So you need to put it over there. Differential enforcement, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then again, refusing accommodations. Crime-free ordinances. So here's another thing we talk a lot about. So ordinances that you restrict certain types of behavior or allowing, yeah. It all kind of comes down to we want certain types of people to live here, and we don't want other types of people to live here. And they're not illegal in and of themselves, but if you look more deeply at the different policies, they could be. So policies that, don't take into consideration domestic violence situations, okay? So a survivor of domestic violence is now faced with eviction because, they're a survivor, right? Sometimes these ordinances don't even take that into consideration. Sometimes they might not differentiate between who the victim was and who the perpetrator was. It's just, there was a call here. And there was a call here, so you need to leave. And we're not even going to question what was really going on. Again, people with disabilities, no flexibility there. And then also passing these ordinances kind of in retaliation. And along those lines of, well, we don't want these people moving in, so we're going to pass an ordinance to keep them out. Okay, no. Code enforcement is another thing that as a city you should think about. So enforcing codes should be equal and fair. Okay, so citing people who belong to a particular protected class and not citing people who belong to other protected classes could be discriminatory. Like if you're not citing people for a code enforcement who are white living on the east bench of Salt Lake, but you are only giving these violations to people of color on the west side of Salt Lake, that's a problem. Driving through different neighborhoods to do code enforcement. I see your vehicles all the time, driving through different places, checking garbage cans, seeing what people have going on their properties. And that's okay. But if you are only driving around like on the west side of Salt Lake and you're not doing that on the east side of Salt Lake and you're only being responsive to complaints in this neighborhood, but you're actively seeking to give violations in another neighborhood, that's problematic. And then also retaliation. So maybe somebody asks for an accommodation and you don't like that they did that. So you start looking for violations. Okay, that's not okay. And then the last thing I kind of want to talk about and just spend the last time that I have with you going over is just this idea of increasing fair housing choice, increasing choice, okay? Making a stronger community for people. So a few things to think about. So municipalities should make available for people who live within those jurisdictions information about this, okay? So like on your website, should hopefully have like a fair housing page, maybe. A page that has your accommodation procedure, which I searched for on your website, I couldn't find. You should also offer this information to housing providers and developers. Okay, if somebody wants to be a landlord in Salt Lake, give them this information. Give them information that we make available for landlords. Make sure that developers know they have to comply with the Fair Housing Act. Elected officials and all staff of a city receiving fair housing trainings. Like it's great that you all are here. But I'm assuming there are probably more people in your departments that aren't watching or aren't here that could also benefit from a training. Also, other departments that could benefit from a training. Like I would love to give a fair housing training to the mayor and the city council. So think about training all of the staff within the city. The next one, you should have a procedure. Well, it's a good idea to have a procedure for an accommodation request. The joint statement from HUD and the DOJ, it doesn't say you have to, but it's a good idea. And again, I couldn't find it on your website, but I do have a copy because it was sent to me when we were asking for an accommodation. But you should make that available to people so people can access it. Do an inventory of your ordinances, crime-free ordinances if you have them. Maybe take a fresh look at them from this perspective. Is this discriminatory in some way? implement practices that ensure fair public meetings. So remember that Draper town hall meeting I referenced? That wasn't a very fair town hall meeting, right? And so make sure that when people are giving feedback, it's not shutting others out and all people have opportunity to participate. And then also speaking of all people having opportunity to participate, when it comes to affirmatively furthering fair housing, you should be talking to other people. I think Salt Lake does a good job of reaching out to Andrew and myself for information when you're reporting and trying to affirmatively further fair housing. But you should maybe open that up to the public, okay? It's like, put that out there to the public and invite a conversation about housing discrimination and fair housing laws openly and not just with us. We're glad you involve us. You can involve other people. And then just a few more inclusive practices. So if you're having a conversation with someone, you know, if you're doing zoning stuff, having a conversation, pay attention to what someone is saying when it comes to accommodations. They might not say accommodation. And for us, that's the magic word, Fair Housing Act, right? Accommodation. Variance is a word I think that you all might use, right? But that's the same thing, right? They also might say something like, well, can you change that? Or can I change that? Again, it's not the magic word of accommodation, but that's what they're talking about, or an exception, okay? So pay attention to those. They might not say accommodation, but they still might be talking about it. Also, they might mention disability. So, okay, they mentioned disability. We're going to be proactive, and I'm going to pay particular attention to see if I hear that they do need something. Okay, you can be proactive on that. Or if they say disability, you know, in your communications, you can link to that policy about how to make an accommodation that you're going to put on your website. Okay. And then even if it doesn't come up, you can still be proactive and offer the information to people, whether they say disability, whether they say accommodation or not. And then the last one up here, how many of you have had a diversity training? Like, it's a pretty common thing these days, right? Was disability included in that training? Because oftentimes that's left out. So think about that and adding disability to conversations about diversity and how to be competent working with people who have disabilities as well. So that's all I have. We have 2 more minutes. If anybody has another question that I can evade answering. Yeah.
So for my position, I do a lot of rehabilitation for commercial buildings. Would that fall under fair housing, or is there different?
Yeah, so this is so this is housing. It'd probably be more like Americans with Disabilities Act. And I don't have that information. Do you have any comments on that, Andrew?
No, you're right on it, but if there is, if there are questions or interested in knowing more about how a lot of this applies to commercial, buildings or in business or commercial setting, we do have information on that and folks that can provide technical assistance and other types of advice and guidance.
Yeah, and yeah, I don't know the specifics, but I do know that there are a lot of inaccessible buildings out there that have been rehabilitated. I'm sure Andrew's experienced that. I experience it trying to go out and about with my sister all the time. It's like, whoa, there's a step.
A lot of the things that a lot of the physical access issues that you touched on here in the context of fair housing also exist in the business or commercial space as well, and as Bart said, there, again, there's, you know, a whole host of, you know, 200-page booklet of all of the pieces of that. And again, there are limitations about to what it applies and when it applies, but we can help with all of that.
Yeah, and like I said a couple times, you could also be proactive. You can go above and beyond.
Yeah.
So even if you don't have to, you can. You
Yeah,
still can.
if you all have me back to have this conversation, that the going above and beyond part is what that discussion is good. How can we work together to do more?
Yeah. And I don't know if I saw any other hands. I know we're out of time. So thanks again for having us.
Thanks.
If you have any questions or you want to have more conversations, just get in touch with us and we're happy to do that.
We recorded this, so if any other staff in your department want it, we can send you the recording. Feel free to reach out to Ethan Sellers.